I pulled into the motel parking lot, exhausted from nearly 10 hours on the road. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and now the neon sign of the Sunridge Inn buzzed faintly in the crisp night air. It was one of those roadside motels that seemed to exist outside of time. Outdated furniture, flickering hallway lights, and the ever-present scent of old carpets mixed with cheap air fresheners. But it was the only place within 50 miles, and I was too tired to be picky. The man at the reception desk barely looked up when I rang the bell. His face was shadowed by the dim overhead light, and he mumbled through the check-in process, handing me a key with a number barely visible on its worn tag. "Room 107, he said. "Keep it down at night." I nodded, taking the key without a second thought. The hallway leading to my room had peeling wallpaper and doors that looked like they'd been repainted a dozen times over. When I found my room, I noticed that the door to 108, the one right next to mine, was slightly ajar. The lights inside flickered, but there was no movement. Maybe someone forgot to close it properly. I entered my own room and locked the door. It was just as expected: stained carpet, a bed with a sagging mattress, and a TV that looked like it hadn't worked since the early 2000s. I tossed my bag onto the chair, took off my shoes, and sat on the bed, stretching out my aching legs. Then I heard it, a rhythmic knocking. It came from the room next door, 108. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more knocks. I frowned, waiting to see if it would stop, but the pattern continued. Knock, knock, knock. Silence. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't loud, just steady, deliberate. I figured someone must be trying to get the attention of whoever was inside. Maybe they didn't realize the door was open. I considered ignoring it, but after a few minutes, the repetition started to crawl under my skin. I grabbed my room key and stepped outside. The hallway was silent. The door to 108 was still slightly open, revealing only the dim flickering light inside. I hesitated before knocking gently on the doorframe. "Hey, you all right in there?" No response. The knocking had stopped. I pushed the door open just a little more. The room looked unoccupied, bed untouched, no luggage, nothing personal. Just the same outdated furniture as my room. The flickering light made everything look uneasy, shadows stretching and shifting. I closed the door, deciding it wasn't my problem. Maybe it was just something loose inside the walls. I went back to my room, locked the door, and climbed into bed. My exhaustion should have knocked me out instantly, but sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise from the hallway made my skin prickle. Sometime past midnight, I heard footsteps outside my door. Slow, shuffling steps. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped right outside my door. I stared at the gap beneath it, waiting for a shadow to pass, for some movement that would confirm I wasn't imagining things. Nothing. Then the knocking started again. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. It was closer now. Not from 108. From my door. I sat up, heart pounding. I didn't dare move. The knocks continued, steady and deliberate. Whoever was on the other side wasn't going away. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it toward the door. The moment the light hit it, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was thick and unnatural, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I waited, my ears straining for any sign of movement. Nothing. I forced myself to lie back down, keeping my phone clutched in my hand. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When I finally drifted off into uneasy sleep, I was woken by the sound of shouting outside. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled to the door and cracked it open. 2 police officers were standing outside room 108. The door was now wide open, and the motel manager was speaking to them in hushed, frantic tones. I stepped into the hallway, trying to piece together what was happening. One of the officers noticed me. "Did you see or hear anything unusual last night?" I hesitated. Yeah, there was knocking. Late at night. First from 108, then from my door. The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "What time?" "I'm not sure. After midnight, I think." The motel manager wiped his face, looking visibly shaken. "A woman checked into 108 yesterday morning. Paid for a week, no luggage. Housekeeping found her this morning. door was locked from the inside. "Found her?" I asked, throat dry. The manager nodded grimly. "She was dead. Looks like she'd been dead since yesterday afternoon." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. My skin prickled, a sick realization creeping over me. If she had already been dead, who had been knocking? I had been working as the night manager at the Pine Hollow Motel for 3 years when I first noticed him. A man in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, who checked into room 209 and never checked out. At first, I assumed he was just another long-term guest. Some people stayed for weeks, even months, drifting through life with nowhere else to go. But something about him felt different. He paid in cash every Monday morning, always the exact amount, always in worn, crumpled bills. He never spoke more than necessary, never complained about anything, and never asked for cleaning service. Most guests, even the long-term ones, had some sort of schedule, something to occupy their time. But this man, whom I came to know only as Mr. Delaney from the name he wrote in the registry, never left his room during the day. The only time I ever saw him step outside was after midnight. It became routine. Just as my shift began, I'd catch a glimpse of him walking out of his room, dressed in the same brown coat and gray slacks, his posture stiff but his steps precise. He would leave through the side entrance, the one that wasn't covered by our security cameras, and disappear into the night. I never saw where he went, and I never saw him return. But by the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., his door was always closed and locked from the inside. At first, I didn't think much of it. Plenty of people worked odd hours or had strange habits. But after a few months, it started bothering me. What kind of person never needed supplies? Never had a visitor? Never made a noise? The maids were instructed not to enter his room, and when I asked if they ever saw him, they all said the same thing. No, the door was always locked, and the "Do Not Disturb" sign never moved. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I waited until he left, then grabbed the spare key, and walked to room 209. The door opened with a faint creak, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The air was stale, thick with a metallic scent that made my stomach turn. The room was neat, eerily so. The bed was made with military precision, the trash bin empty, the surfaces wiped clean. There was no luggage, no toiletries, nothing to suggest a person had been living there for months. The only sign of life was on the desk. A single notebook, open to a page filled with tight, slanted handwriting. I glanced at the words, expecting meaningless scribbles, but what I read sent a chill through my spine. It was a list of names, dates, and locations. Some of them I recognized, missing persons cases I'd seen on the news. Others were unfamiliar. The most recent entry was dated just 2 days ago. I shut the notebook and left the room, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I returned to the front desk. I considered calling the police. But what would I tell them? That a man who always paid on time and never caused trouble might be responsible for something sinister? That I broke into his room and read his private journal? Instead, I did something worse. I kept quiet. For the next few weeks, I monitored him closely. I took note of the nights he left, the times he returned, how long he stayed inside before venturing out again. And then, one morning, I checked the motel ledger and saw something that turned my stomach. His payment hadn't come in. Room 209 was vacant. I ran upstairs and knocked. No answer. Using the spare key again, I opened the door, but this time, the room wasn't just empty. It was stripped bare. The bed was made, the walls bare, the desk empty. No notebook. No sign that anyone had ever stayed there. I checked the security cameras, hoping for an answer. The footage from the previous night was normal until around 2 a.m. That's when the screen glitched, just for a second. When the image returned, the door to room 209 was ajar. No sign of Mr. Delaney. No sign of anyone at all. I called the police then. They searched the room, questioned the staff, and checked our records. But there was nothing to go on. Mr. Delaney wasn't his real name. The money he had paid with was impossible to trace. No one had seen him leave. It was as if he had never existed. For weeks, I waited, half expecting him to return. but he never did. And every time I passed room 209, I felt that lingering unease, that gnawing guilt. It was a slow afternoon at the Redwood Inn, the kind of small roadside motel that saw more truckers and drifters than families on vacation. I was working the front desk, flipping idly through the guest ledger when a man walked in. He was in his early 40s, tall and lean, dressed in a well-pressed suit that looked out of place in a place like this. He placed a duffel bag on the counter and asked, "Can you hold this for me? Just for a little while." I hesitated. We weren't a luggage service, and I had seen enough to know that favors like this often led to trouble. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't store personal belongings." His face remained neutral, but there was something behind his eyes, something that made my stomach tighten. "It won't be long. Just a couple of hours. I'll pay you." He slid a crisp $100 bill across the counter. I should have refused. Every instinct told me to. But my paycheck barely covered my bills, and easy money was hard to pass up. I took the bag, placed it behind the desk, and nodded.
2 hours, I said.
He left without another word. At first, I ignored the bag. I busied myself with minor tasks, wiping down the counter, checking the register, but my eyes kept drifting toward it. It was heavy when I moved it, filled with something solid, something that shifted slightly when I tilted it. I told myself not to open it, but curiosity is a dangerous thing. After half an hour, I gave in. I unzipped it just a little, just enough to see inside. Stacks of money. More than I had ever seen in my life. I zipped it shut just as quickly, my pulse racing. My hands were sweating. This wasn't just someone's travel cash. This was something else. Something dangerous. The minutes crawled by. I glanced at the clock over and over. 1 hour. Then 2. Then 3. The man never returned. By the 4th hour, I was panicking. What if someone came looking for it? What if it was stolen? Or worse, what if it belonged to someone who would kill to get it back? At the 6-hour mark, I made a decision. I couldn't keep it here. I took the bag, shoved it under the front desk, and locked the lobby door. If he came back, I'd tell him I had no choice but to call the police. It wasn't a great plan, but it was all I had. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me sit up in bed. Every shadow in my room felt like a figure watching me. By morning, I made up my mind. I was going to the police. But when I got to work, the bag was gone. I checked the security cameras, my fingers trembling as I rewound the footage. And then I saw it. At 4:13 a.m., a man entered the lobby. Not the one who had left the bag, but someone else. He wore a hood, moved with confidence. He walked straight to the desk, bent down, retrieved the bag, and left. No hesitation. No searching. He knew exactly where it was.